little bit of information today. But like Laura said, please go ahead and post questions in the chat as you have them. So at this point in our sessions, we're finally getting to the point where the war in Europe is coming to a close. On April 30th of 45, Hitler had already committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin as the Soviet troops are closing in. So on May 7th, Germany surrenders, and the following day is Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, with, of course, joyous celebrations all over Europe as well as throughout the world. The war is over, or at least in Europe. The US still has to fight with Japan to end all of that, but the war is over in Europe. But what is that going to mean for the Jewish survivors? What is supposed to be next for them? So as the Allied troops are moving across Europe in a series of offensives against Nazi Germany, they began to encounter tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. This year, actually, 2020, marked the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps and the end of Nazi tyranny. But of course, this past spring with the pandemic wasn't quite the same as a lot of these places would have actually been hosting commemorations in person. But at any rate, so as the Allies are racing towards Berlin at the end of the war, they come upon different camps, depending upon where they are while they're advancing towards Berlin. You can see the camps liberated by each of the armies, Allied armies on the slide here. The Soviets, of course, get to Nazi-occupied Poland first because of geography. So they're the ones who come across the killing centers from the final solution. So they are the ones who liberate Auschwitz, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The US forces liberated Buchenwald, Dachau, Dora-Mittelbau, Flossenburg, and Mauthausen, while the British are more in the northern region of Germany. So they end up getting to Neuengamme and Bergen-Belsen. When the British entered Bergen-Belsen in mid-April of 45, there were some 60,000 prisoners who were found alive. However, most of them were in critical condition because of the typhus epidemic, as well as just the work conditions, not getting proper food, etc. Sadly, more than 10,000 of them died from the effects of malnutrition or disease within just a few weeks of liberation. So even though they had survived up until the point of liberation, sadly, many of them didn't actually get to realize that freedom. The liberators confronted unspeakable conditions in the Nazi camps where piles of corpses lay unburied. Only after the liberation of the camps was the full scope of the Nazi horrors exposed to the world. The small percentage of inmates who did survive resembled skeletons because of the demands of the forced labor and the lack of food compounded by months and years of maltreatment, so much like you see in the photos on this slide. Many were so weak that they could hardly move. Disease remained an ever-present danger, and many of the camps actually had to be burned down to prevent the spread of epidemics. For those who did survive the camps, they faced a long and difficult road to recovery. As it became more and more clear that the Allies were going to win the war, the SS evacuated most of the camp prisoners further west during the spring of 44, all retreating back towards Germany. In late July of 44, the Soviets approached Lublin, Poland, where the remaining camp staff hastily abandoned Majdanek without fully dismantling the camp. When Soviet troops first arrived, there were 500 prisoners who were found still alive. Majdanek was the first major concentration camp to be liberated. Soviet officials invited journalists to come and inspect the camp and inspect the evidence of the horrors that had occurred in there and become apparent. By the summer of 1944, the Soviets also took over the sites of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka killing centers. The Nazis had dismantled most of those camps in 1943 after the majority of the Jewish population of Poland had already been killed in those camps. In January of 45, the Soviets liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the killing centers. The Nazis had forced the majority of the Auschwitz prisoners to march westward on what so-called death marches. Soviet soldiers found over 6,000 emaciated prisoners alive when they entered the camp. There was an abundant evidence of mass murder in Auschwitz. The retreating Germans had destroyed most of the warehouses in the camp, but in the remaining warehouses, they found personal belongings of the victims. They discovered, for example, hundreds of thousands of men's suits, more than 800,000 women's outfits, and more than 14,000 pounds of human hair. It's hard to even comprehend those kinds of numbers. And of course, that all represented people. The photo here is a group of female survivors as they're trudging through the snow immediately after the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And here you can see a map of some of the death marches. So in January 45, as Germany is standing on the verge of military defeat and Allied forces are approaching these Nazi camps, the SS organized these death marches of the camp inmates, in part to keep large numbers of the prisoners from falling into Allied hands, and in part to just make sure that the stories of these atrocities would not get out, which is why they were trying to dismantle some of the camps as well, and then get the prisoners out, march them on the roads. They would die on the open streets, and then they were hoping that the world wouldn't see what they had actually done in these camps. Many of the prisoners had survived the forced marches into the interior of Germany from the camps in occupied Poland. They were suffering from starvation and disease, and the unspeakable conditions that the liberators confronted started to shed light on what had really happened. So we're going to watch a couple of minutes of a few different survivors talk about their experience during the death march.
During the final stages of the war, as Allied forces drew closer, concentration and death camps were evacuated. Prisoners were force-marched over long distances toward camps in German territory. These evacuations became known as death marches. Those who could not keep up were shot.
There was freshly fallen snow for as far as the eye could see. An enormous it was a plateau, and then came up to a gentle hill. And it was just covered with snow. It was gray. It was snowing. And we were told to assemble 4 abreast. So of course there were the 4 of us. And we held hands and we took the first step. And I guess we all knew that this is going to be the first step to the end of the road, either to liberation or to doom. And in front of us stretched this incredible line. And when people looked, with gray camp blankets over them, they looked like winged death. It's all you could see. Way, way ahead, 4,000 girls. And on the side were the SS men and the SS women, and they lifted their whips and they said, "Forward march." And we started to march.
If you stayed out of the line, you were shot. So you had to behave yourself, you had to be strong. The way we slept, the 5 people in the row, 4 held on to one. We took turns in sleeping. One slept 5 minutes, then we woke each other up while walking. That was our existence, and that lasted from January till practically till end of the war.
We left a lot of girls lying in the snow. Many were killed. It was something one can really not describe. My father had asked me when I last saw him in June, the very last day, practically in the last moment, before he left, he said to me, "Where are your skiing boots?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I want you to wear them today." I said, "Papa, skiing shoes in June?" He said, "I want you to wear them." One didn't argue with one's father. So I put on those boots and I wore them throughout my entire stay in the camps for 3 years. And in them I'd also hidden the pictures of my parents and my brother. I didn't know, and I don't know how my father could have known that those boots were really instrumental in saving my life on that march. I had ski shoes. Some girls had sandals. We slept outside. The frost, I saw girls breaking off their toes like twigs. I had my ski boots.
Two young children were brought into a barracks in In Poland,
Hard to comprehend what she's talking about. Obviously, terrible, terrible conditions for them. And the death marches lasted for months in the wintertime in Europe. Well, by April of 1945, General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces during World War II, visited the concentration camp at Ohrdruf, Germany, to personally view the atrocities. He said, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, bestiality were so overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda." And of course, not only is Eisenhower there, but you can also see George Patton and Omar Bradley of the British in the photo as well. Eisenhower's quote is actually etched into the outside of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and it's referred to as the Eisenhower Plaza, which is sort of the back entrance of the museum. We're going to listen to a few other survivors talk about their personal experience of liberation. This first one is Nessie Galperin, or Nessie Godin. Today, she's also a volunteer at the museum. So if you ever have a chance to visit the museum once the pandemic is over, she might actually be sitting at the survivor's desk where you could sit down and talk with her for a while. Her family had a dairy business. They were from Lithuania. When the Nazis occupied Lithuania in 1941 and established the ghetto, that's where Nessie lived until 1943. In 1944, Nessie, her mother, and one of her brothers were deported to the Stutthof camp near Danzig. She worked in several sub-camps until January of 1945, when the inmates were sent on a death march. In March of 1945, after 3 months of enduring the brutal death march, she was liberated by the Soviets. Eventually, Nessie, her mother, and her 2 brothers, who all survived, which is quite miraculous that many people in one family survived, they eventually emigrated together to the US in 1950. So this is her story of liberation.
Let me tell you how I saw myself a few days after liberation. I have not seen myself in a mirror for almost 2 years. A few days after we were free, the Russians carried us bodily actually to the village, put us in little houses until the makeshift hospital was made. And as I was laying in one of those houses on a straw sack, I saw a door with a window pane. And I thought, I'm free. Let me look outside how the free world looks. But as I looked through that little window pane, I saw a reflection of the most horrible thing that anyone can imagine. A skeleton covered with skin, with big blue eyes. And as I turned around to look whose reflection I saw, I realized that was my reflection. This is how I looked.
But we got weaker every day because there was nothing to eat. Finally, the last day when we had nothing, I could barely drag myself. I said to my sister, I'm going into the barrack and I'm going to lie down and just die in there. I do not want to die and people should just step over me like others do. They followed me. We all lie down there and just almost said goodbye to life. One of our friends, she was even younger than I was, the youngest. She was always searching, trying to find a way. So she said she has to take the last look outside and see what's going on. When she came back, she said to me, there's something funny going out there. People are running all over the place, and it's unusual. It's not what usually happens. And I told her to just lay down and die in peace. She must be hallucinating. She insisted, so my sister walked out with her. When my sister came back, I don't know with what strength she came back, grabbed me by my arm, and she says, "Get up, get up. Guess what? Everybody's running, and the gates are open. There's a man sitting, is it a tank or whatever?" We couldn't distinguish at that time one thing from the other. He's speaking through a loudspeaker. His words are being translated. I think we were liberated. When I got up and walked outside, my eyes couldn't comprehend. It just didn't register. It's unbelievable. I couldn't believe this was really true. So I said to my sister that she has to grab me by my arm and do something physical. So I realized I am really alive and we were liberated. It was the English army that liberated us.
I ran in that direction, and as I came onto that place, I noticed many prisoners yelling and screaming and jumping and dancing, and there, standing among them, were 7 giants, young people. They must have been 18 or 19 American soldiers. There were 7 or 8 of them standing inside the camp. Apparently, they cut the wire and came into the camp. They were bewildered by us, wild and unkempt and dirty, and I'm sure smelly people jumping and dancing and trying to embrace them and kiss them. And I did too. I also joined the crowd and yelled and screamed, and somehow knew that the day of liberation has come. It was a strange feeling for me, however, because as I remembered, on the one hand, I was overwhelmed by this unexpected and unhoped for encounter of freedom, but at the same time, what was happening was outside of me. I didn't know what to make of it. I knew I was free, but I didn't count on it. I somehow didn't know what it meant. And I knew it was great, but I was overjoyed because all people around me were overjoyed and were singing and dancing, but I was 17. I was free, but what it meant, I wasn't sure.
You'll notice on the slide it says that George spent 3 years during the war in 10 different concentration camps. And he asks a very good question. He says, you know, they were ecstatic, obviously, to be liberated, but what did that exactly mean? Of cost, what was liberation be for them? Some were in dire need of medical attention, and although liberated, were in such terrible shape not live to see their freedom realized. For those who were somewhat healthy or could be nursed back to life, where were they to go? For most of them, their homes and belongings had been taken from them. They didn't know if anyone else from their family or community had survived, and if so, how would they find them? How would they be reunited? So all of these people became labeled as displaced persons, or DPs. The photos on this page, the top one is a women's ward of the hospital at Bergen-Belsen camp. The one on the bottom left is a group of women at the same Bergen-Belsen camp, and what they have in their arms are actually loaves of bread. And you can see the huge smiles on their faces that they now have food. And then some of the children peering through one of the windows at the DP camp. From 1945 to 1952, there were more than 250,000 Jewish displaced persons, or DPs, living in camps and urban centers in Germany, Austria, and Italy. These overcrowded and bleak environments provided the barest of necessities. They would soon be joined by those who were rescued from other occupied areas, and by those who had survived the war, maybe hiding in forests or caves, those who had been in the resistance or the partisan bands, or those passing themselves off as Christians. So it wasn't just the people from the camps. All of these other individuals who had managed to survive were now coming out as well and needed the same thing: food, medical attention, a place to go because they didn't have a home anymore. The camps initially were intended just as an emergency shelter for the displaced persons of the war. And for the most part, it was the same concentration camp that was now going to be used as a displaced persons camp. So they were still surrounded by barbed wire, but they were free to come and go, but obviously not the kind of place you would want to have to stay in very long. You can also see the photo here on the bottom. German DPs were moved into a building that had been hit just weeks earlier by aerial bombardment. And you can see all of the people crowded into those windows there. Well, after years of living in mortal fear, the Jews found it hard to be placed among often hostile groups of inhabitants, including Nazi collaborators, because it wasn't just the Jewish survivors. Remember, there were other people in these concentration camps as well, political dissidents, etc. So it wasn't just a camp for just the Jewish people. But if they didn't stay at the DP camp, the other option was to go back to their country of origin. But there was still so much anti-Semitism that that was considered even more dangerous. The Allies had established these DP camps in the Allied occupied part of Germany, and then in Austria and Italy for the refugees waiting to leave Europe. Most of the Jewish DPs preferred to emigrate and they wanted to go to Palestine. Many also sought entry into the United States. But if you think back to our session that we had about the problems with trying to escape, again, all of that paperwork, they still need to proceed with all of that. Just because the war is over with doesn't change the immigration policies for most of these countries. So they remained in the DP camps until they could actually finally get out of Europe. At the end of 1946, the number of Jewish DPs was estimated at about 250,000, of whom about 185,000 were in Germany, 45,000 in Austria, and about 20,000 in Italy. Most of the Jewish DPs were refugees from Poland, many of whom had fled the Nazis into the interior of the Soviet Union during the war, or were now making their way back. Well, President Truman decided to send a special envoy to go and inspect these camps to see what was really happening and to check on the conditions. So his special envoy, Earl Harrison, who is the gentleman on the right, went to Germany in the summer of '45 to inspect the conditions in the US administered displaced persons camp. He invited Dr. Joseph Swartz, the gentleman on the left, and he was the director of overseas operations for the Joint Distribution Committee, and he was sent to accompany him. Their subsequent report is some significant improvements and finally some separate camps just for the Jewish people. So supplementing the relief that was supplied by the US Army, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, and then the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, provided critical services such as food, medicine, clothing, education, religious materials. The JDC was placing special attention on the unique needs of the growing population of the children in the camps. So you can see that they've started schools. They're teaching different trades to people. So the women are learning seamstress skills. The men are actually repairing watches. And then you have a group of refugees who have been finally provided some new clothing, and they're standing in line to be counted at the DP camp. More than 1.2 million Jewish children had been murdered in the Holocaust. So children made up only a tiny portion of concentration camp survivors. Remember, they were usually the first ones to be sent to the gas chambers. Those who did survive suffered from malnutrition, disease, and extreme trauma. Their numbers grew as the children who had spent the war in hiding or among the partisans made their way back to these DP camps. The care of orphan children became a top priority for the Joint Distribution Committee. After the immediate need of getting rest, food, clothing, medical attention, after those needs were addressed, orphans were sent to the JDC Children's Home, which might be in France, Switzerland, England, other countries when possible. Sometimes they were otherwise given a separate section of a DP camp where only children were kept. This particular center that you see here was established to rehabilitate the thousands of non-German children who were left homeless after the war. The 350 children that were housed in this center represented over 20 different nationalities. Many of the children were actually kidnapped by the Nazis and brought back to the Reich for forced labor. Most had their names changed so that they no longer knew their actual real identities. Therefore, trying to locate their families was nearly impossible. But here at these centers, they did attempt to trace the identity of the children and place them back with their parents if their parents had survived, which was unlikely. Also, they would try to arrange for an adoption for the children, the return to their homelands, or their emigration to a new country for settlement. The Buchenwald children were a group of approximately 1,000 Jewish child survivors. Most were boys, and they had been part of the forced labor at that camp. They were found by American troops when they liberated Buchenwald on April 11th of 1945. Most of the children were originally from Poland, although some did come from Hungary and Slovenia. Unsure of what to do with these child survivors, there were two rabbis in the American Army, and they contacted the Jewish Children's Relief Organization in Geneva. That organization helped to arrange for these children to be sent to 3 different countries, and you can see the breakdown of the numbers there. So on June 2nd of 1945, they departed for France, the 427 of them, and one of the rabbis went along with them to ensure that they would be transferred safely. Because of the difficulty in finding clothing for the children, the boys were actually clad in Hitler Youth uniforms, which is hard to even believe after everything that they've been through. This obviously created a problem. When the train crossed over into France, they're greeted by an angry mob who assumed the train was carrying Nazi youth. After that, they started painting on the outside of the train that these were Buchenwald orphans so that they would avoid that confusion. 4 days later, the French transport arrives at the train station and the orphans are taken into a children's home. The home had been set up to accommodate young children, but in fact, only 30 out of this 427 of them were actually boys below the age of 13. This was one of the many problems faced by the personnel at the children's home. They were not prepared to handle a large group of demanding, rebellious teenagers who were full of anger for what they had experienced, and rightly so. The boys were given medical care, counseling, some schooling until more permanent accommodations could be found. Most of them only stayed in the children's home about 4 to 8 weeks before being moved elsewhere. Among the first to leave were a group of 173 who had family in Palestine, so they were given immigration certificates and departed from Marseille in July. The remaining boys were soon transferred to other residences and homes, and by the end of 1948, all of the Buchenwald children who had come to France had left the children's home and begun new lives for themselves. In the US zone of Salzburg in Austria, children on their own at the DP camps received special attention from the JDC. Clothing was in short supply as cold weather was approaching, so many wore altered army uniforms, as you can see in this picture here. If you look closely, you can tell that a number of them are wearing army jackets. There are also stories of US soldiers at these DP camps who befriended the children, providing sweets for them, teaching them how to curse and swear. There was a survivor who used to come to talk to my students, and he said that the soldiers were his best friends in the camp, but those were the first English words he actually learned. So, and it cracks me up when I see this photo of this little boy on the far right with that big grin on his face. You can understand why many of the soldiers would have been drawn to the children and wanting to help them, and so providing them with sweets and other kinds of things. Soon after liberation, survivors began searching for their families. Again, the United Nations organization was establishing a central tracing bureau to help them locate relatives who had survived the camps. They also had public radio broadcasts and newspapers that contained lists of survivors and where exactly they were at. The attempt to reunite families also went hand in hand with the creation of new ones. There were many weddings and many births that were now taking place in these DP camps. This wedding dress was made from a parachute, and it's one of the artifacts that the U.S. Holocaust Museum in DC has. And I've seen it, and it's quite incredible. It's actually one of my favorite artifacts. It's not in the museum itself. It's kept actually at their offsite location. What you see in the museum is only about 10% of all of the artifacts that they do have. The story behind the dress, It belonged to a woman by the name of Lily. She was from Czechoslovakia, where her father was a rabbi as well as a traveling salesman. She had 5 siblings. Celia was the oldest, and she had already moved to the US in the early 1930s. Her father had to raise the children alone after a premature death of his wife from cancer. In 1941, during the war, Celia, the child who had been sent to America, is old enough, and she actually sent tickets for her father and her brothers to come to the US. So she had arranged for them to get out, but they were unable to obtain the necessary visas on their side to get out of Europe. In the spring of 44, the family was arrested and deported to Auschwitz, where her father and 2 brothers were killed immediately. Lily and her 2 sisters were selected for forced labor, and they managed to stay together and support each other in Auschwitz and the subsequent transfer to Bergen-Belsen. Upon their liberation in Bergen-Belsen on April 15th of 1945, the 3 sisters were taken to a nearby hospital in the nearby town. They remained there while waiting the opportunity to reunite with their sister who was already in the United States. In June, while waiting to receive food rations at the DP camp, Lily met a gentleman by the name of Ludwig Friedman. He was also a survivor from Czechoslovakia. Lily and Ludwig became engaged that fall, and they married on June 7th, 1946. Ludwig had promised Lily that he would find fabric for a white gown for their wedding. He somehow managed to purchase an old parachute from a German soldier in the area, and Lily hired a seamstress to make the dress in exchange for her cigarette ration. Lily's sister and a cousin eventually were married as well, and they wore the same gown. And over time, about 17 to 20 different young brides in the DP camp had worn the same gown made out of the parachute. And on the right is the picture of Lily and Ludwig at their wedding with her dress. And the picture on the left is one of the other brides who wore the same dress at her wedding as well. Pretty incredible. We heard from Fela earlier about liberation, and now she's going to talk a little bit about the DP camps. She went to a displaced persons camp administered by the Americans just outside of Munich. She got married in the camp in 46 and eventually immigrated to the US.
People and felt a feeling all over Europe. It wasn't only from Poland. We had Hungarian Jews, Romanian Jews, Czech Jews, and also Greek Jews in this camp. Everyone just walking around and trying to mingle and find someone. Like I said, we never did. But what the Americans also did is organize art schools. They brought in films. They brought in, organized our people, survivors that were musicians, and also traveling from other camps. They were giving concerts, and believe it or not, even dances for those that were well enough to attend all this. And also our own police force to police that it would be safe, you know, from other intruders. They kept us busy. But the problem was there was no future in being there. Where do we go from there?
So as Lily says, with no future in the DP camps, obviously there needed to be a next step. There had to be something else. Unfortunately, after liberation, many of the Jewish survivors were afraid to return to their former homes because of the continued anti-Semitism that persisted and due to the trauma that they had suffered. Just because the war ended did not mean that those anti-Semitic sentiments also ended. The children in Germany had had 12 years of Nazi propaganda and Nazi ideology as their school curriculum. The Jewish people had already experienced the shock and horror of neighbors and people that they thought were their friends turning on them. So you can imagine not too many were anxious to actually return home. Some who did return home had neighbors or other strangers living in their home now, and they had no legal claim to that property after being stripped of their citizenship and other rights. They also had no money to try and buy anything back, even if that was an option, which granted they shouldn't have to buy back their own possessions or their home, but even if that was an option, where were they supposed to have money? Many who traveled back home ended up fearing for their lives. In post-war Poland, for example, there were a number of pogroms, violent anti-Jewish riots, The largest of these occurred in the town of Kels. On July 1st, 1946, so again, this is after the war ends, there's a 9-year-old non-Jewish boy, Henrik, who left his home in Kels without informing his parents. He returns 2 days later on July 3rd, and in an effort to avoid punishment for wandering off, the boy tells his parents and the police that he'd been kidnapped and hidden in the basement of the local Jewish committee building. Well, the committee building was actually sheltering about 180 Jewish people. It also housed various Jewish institutions that were operating in Kels at the time. The local police went to investigate the alleged crime, but Henrik's story had already begun unraveling. The building, for example, had no basement where he said he had been held. Even so, they decided to investigate. A large crowd of angry Poles, including 1,000 workers from the steel mill, gathered outside the building. Polish soldiers and policemen entered the building and called upon the Jewish residents to surrender any weapons. And keep in mind, back in the 30s, when they were stripped of all their rights, part of that was the right to have any firearms. So chances are nobody in there actually had a weapon anyway. After an unidentified individual fired a shot, which is interesting that they say it was an unidentified individual because there were army personnel there, there were police officers, they obviously had weapons. It was never discovered that any of the Jewish people had a weapon, but at any rate, somebody fires a shot and many of the Jewish people tried to flee the building, but then they run into the angry crowd. So in the end, 42 people were killed and over 40 more injured. The boy's lie about his whereabouts also fed into that old anti-Semitic myth about the blood libel, about Jewish people kidnapping Christian children and using their blood in religious rituals. Well, this atrocity after the war, after everything that these people had been through and yet had somehow managed to survive, only to make it back home and then be attacked and killed after the war. Again, just hard to fathom. So people were saying that the Jewish people really needed a safe haven, a place to call their own. And so there was more talk about the formation of the Jewish state of Israel. In the DP camps, the Jews were already forming some self-governing organizations, and many were working toward the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. There were central committees of Jewish DPs in the American and British zones, and their primary goal was really to press for greater immigration opportunities and the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a place that would offer freedom and safety to the Jews who had endured so much persecution and violence from continued anti-Semitism and the horrors of the Holocaust. The British, who had received a mandate from the League of Nations to administer Palestine, had been severely restricting Jewish immigration, largely because of Arab objections. Many countries around the world still had their borders closed to immigrants after the war. Despite these obstacles, many of the Jewish DPs did attempt to leave Europe as soon as possible and tried to flee to Palestine. The British then started to imprison some of the Jewish refugees trying to leave Europe for Palestine, many of them obviously Holocaust survivors. And this started to turn world opinion against the British policy in Palestine. A report of Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry in January of '46 led President Harry Truman to pressure Britain into admitting 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. As the crisis escalated, the British government decided to submit what they considered this problem of Palestine to the United Nations for them to make a final decision. In a special session, the UN General Assembly voted on November 29th of 1947 to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, the other Arab. This was a recommendation that the Jewish leaders accepted, however, the Arabs rejected. After the British began the withdrawal of their military forces from Palestine in early April of 1948, Zionist leaders moved to establish a modern Jewish state. So on May 14th, 1948, the chairman of the Jewish Agency for Palestine announced the formation of the State of Israel, declaring the Nazi Holocaust, which engulfed millions of Jews in Europe, proved anew the urgency of the reestablishment of the Jewish state, which would solve the problem of Jewish homelessness by opening the gates to all Jews and lifting the Jewish people to equality in the family of nations. Well, a day later, on May 15th, the United States, President Truman recognized the State of Israel, and soon after that, the Soviet Union did as well, all of this to legitimize this new country. Holocaust survivors from DP camps in Europe and from British detention centers on Cyprus were welcomed into the Jewish homeland. Many of them fought in Israel's War of Independence that came shortly after its creation in 1948, as well as in 1949. And in 1953, Yad Vashem was established. This is Israel's national institution for Holocaust commemoration. Well, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, the world was also faced with a challenge. How do you seek justice for an almost unimaginable scale of criminal behavior? The International Military Tribunal that was held in Nuremberg, Germany, attempted to broach this immense challenge. On October 18th of 1945, the chief prosecutors brought charges against 24 leading Nazi officials. But when you think of the scale of the crime, the first question is, well, why only 24 people? Literally, there were only 24 seats in the dock, which seems like a crazy reason to limit it to 24 people. But on Thursday in our session about bearing witness, we're going to watch a short film in which Ben Ferenz, who was the lead prosecutor for the US in the trial against the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units, he explains more about this. But for now, suffice it to say that with so many of the Nazi leaders were already dead from committing suicide, or they managed to escape, they went into hiding. So they went after the remaining leadership, saying that this was really a leadership crime. They were educated men. Many of them held doctorates, some held double doctorates. So they believed that going after the leadership would send a message to future leaders, and hopefully this would deter something like this from happening again. They formally opened in Nuremberg, Germany on November 20th, 1945 for the tribunal, just 6.5 months after Germany surrendered. Each of the 4 allied nations, meaning the US, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, supplied a judge. They had 2 judges and a prosecution team. From Great Britain, Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence presided as the main judge. They also had a team of translators who provided simultaneous translations of all of the proceedings in 4 languages: English, French, German, and Russian. The charges against the defendants were crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and then they added conspiracy to commit those 3 things: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The charge of conspiracy was added so that subsequent tribunals would have jurisdiction to prosecute any individual belonging to a proven criminal organization. So therefore, the International Military Tribunal also indicted several Nazi organizations that they deemed to be criminal, such as the Reich Cabinet, the leadership corps of the Nazi Party, the SS, the SD, the Gestapo, the Stormtroopers or the SA, and the General Staff and High Command of the German Armed Forces. The defendants were entitled to a legal counsel of their choosing. And of course, by now, Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels were already dead from committing suicide, so they never stood trial. And there was actually a deliberate decision made about not trying them posthumously, so as not to create the impression that maybe they had managed to escape and were still alive somewhere. Adolf Eichmann, he is captured later, and he is put on trial in Jerusalem. But the 24 defendants, of whom only actually 21 appeared in the courtroom, were chosen from the Nazi diplomatic, economic, political, and military leadership. We'll get into the missing 3 in just a little bit as to why. So the American chief prosecutor, again, each of the allied countries had their own prosecution team. So our chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, decided to argue his case primarily on the basis of the mounds of documents written by the Nazis themselves. Again, they thought that the Third Reich was going to go on for 1,000 years. They wanted to have a museum actually one day showing how they came into power, so they documented everything, which was great by the time the trial comes around that we now have evidence. So he decides to use the documents rather than eyewitness testimony, so that the trial can't be accused of relying on biased or tainted testimony. The testimony presented at Nuremberg revealed much of what we know about the Holocaust today, including the details of Auschwitz, the death machinery that was used, the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's also how the estimate of 6 million Jewish victims comes about. Over 400 visitors attended the proceedings each day, as well as 325 correspondents or journalists representing 23 different countries. So the world was definitely watching what was happening. The judges delivered their verdict on October 1st of 1946. The judges are seated here. There were 2 from each country. So on the left, it's the Soviets, then the British, the Americans, and the French. 12 defendants were sentenced to death. And when they received the death sentence, they were to be hanged and then cremated at Dachau, and their ashes dropped in a river. They didn't want to have any sort of memorialization where people could go and honor them as martyrs or anything like that. 3 of them were sentenced to life in prison. 4 of them were sentenced to prison terms that ranged from 10 to 20 years, and 3 of them were acquitted. Additional trials did take place later, including concentration camp guards and commandants, police officers, members of the Einsatzgruppen, or the mobile killing units, and then doctors who participated in medical experiments. 4 criminals were tried by military courts in the British, American, French, and Soviet zones of occupied Germany and Austria, and also in Italy in the immediate post-war years. Other war crimes were tried in courts of the country that committed their crime. In the courts of West Germany, many former Nazis did not receive severe sentences because they claimed that they were simply following orders, and that was ruled a mitigating circumstance. A number of Nazi criminals therefore returned to normal lives in German society, especially within the business world. The efforts of Nazi hunters, such as Simon Wiesenthal and others, led to the capture, extradition, and trial of a number of Nazis who had escaped from Germany after the war. And the trial of Adolf Eichmann, like we said, is held in Jerusalem in 1961 and captured worldwide attention. Many of the war criminals, however, were never brought to trial or punished. So I know these next 2 slides, it's a lot of names to go through, but we'll just go through them quickly because there's some interesting, there's interesting facts that come out about them. So Gustav Krupp was an industrialist who used forced labor. He was deemed too frail to stand trial, so he was one of those 3 not seated in the dock. But you'll notice he doesn't die until 1950, so he gets to live out the last few years of his life without having had to go to trial or face consequences for what he had done. Robert Ley established the German Labor Party. He committed suicide before the trial began, so he was also one of those missing 3. And Martin Bormann was involved with the plundering of artwork and persecution of the Jews, the euthanasia effort, the expansion of forced labor programs, and he also signed a series of orders for Jewish deportations to the east. He died in an effort to flee Berlin in the last days of World War II, but was long thought to have actually escaped and be living somewhere else. So he was tried in absentia, in Nuremberg, where he was sentenced to death. West German authorities officially declared, somebody must not be muted. That's not, West German authorities officially declared him dead in 1973 after his remains were actually discovered and he was positively identified. Karl Donitz was the commander of the U-boat fleet, the submarines, and he was appointed the Reich president in Hitler's will. He receives 10 years in prison. Hans Frank, the founder of the Nazi Party Attorneys Organization, so again, the court's legitimizing all of this, and later he becomes the governor of occupied Poland. He receives the death penalty. And again, those who receive death penalty, hanging, cremation, ashes thrown in a river. Wilhelm Frick, he was the Reich Minister of the Interior, removed the Jews from public life and sent political opponents to camps. He received the death penalty. Hans Fritzsche was head of the radio propaganda. We talked about him in our propaganda session. He receives 9 years for his sentence, but he's released in September of 1950. Walter Funk, the Minister of Economics and the President of the Reichsbank, he receives a life sentence, but he's released in 1957 due to poor health. But again, notice he lives for 3 years beyond that. And anytime it talks about Ministry of Economics or the Reichsbank, part of what they were responsible for was taking away any of the belongings, the monetary wealth of the Jewish people. Hermann Göring was the commander of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. He ordered Reinhard Heydrich to convene the Wannsee Conference. He receives the death penalty, but he committed suicide. Rudolf Hess was the personal aide to Hitler and the deputy party leader. He receives a life sentence, but he also committed suicide in prison at age 93. Alfred Jodl was the chief of armed forces. He receives the death penalty. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of Reich Security and the security police after Heydrich's death, so he assumes that position. So he becomes a prime figure in the final solution. He receives the death penalty. Wilhelm Keitel was the chief of armed forces, also penalty. And this is the Erich Raeder was commander-in-chief of the Navy. He receives a life sentence, but he's released also due to 1955 with only serving 9 years. And again, notice he lives out 5 more years after supposedly his health was so bad that they let him out. Alfred Rosenberg was the Nazi Party for Affairs in the occupied East Territories. So he was responsible for looting and confiscating Jewish cultural. He received the death penalty. Fritz Sauckel, the General for Deployment of Labor, death penalty. Hallmarschak, the Reichsbank president, he was in a concentration camp after the attempted assassination of Hitler. He had some loose ties with resistance movements, and so they figured he had something to do with it. He was acquitted, but he's tried later at the denunciation trials that they also hold. And at that one, he receives 8 years because he's still Nazi ideology. So he's supposed to go to a work camp for 8 years, but he gets released in 1948 and he lives the rest of his life till 1970 in freedom. Arthur Secord, he was the right governor of in the Netherlands. So he was responsible for the deportation of the Dutch Jews. He receives the death penalty. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect and the Reich Minister of Armaments and Munitions. He was also appointed the Inspector General for construction projects in Berlin. So he was responsible for rebuilding Berlin, and his department oversaw the apartments from which the Jews in Berlin were evicted and then reallocated to non-Jews. As the Reich Minister of Armaments and Munitions, he used millions of forced laborers to raise production. During the Nuremberg trial, he did acknowledge the regime's guilt. He's the only one who did. And he also took some personal responsibility for using slave labor. His show of a little bit of remorse helped account for a lenient sentence. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he's released in 1966. Julius Streicher, the propagandist and editor of Der Stürmer, receives the death penalty. Konstantin van Neurath, foreign minister, gets a 15-year sentence, but again, released due to poor health in 1954 after serving only 8 years, and he lives 2 more years in freedom then. Franz von Papen was the former chancellor and ambassador to Austria, responsible for the Anschluss of Austria. He's actually acquitted, sentenced to a labor camp at the denazification trial, because again, he's still spewing Nazi ideology, but he was released completely upon appeals. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, receives death penalty, and Baldur von Schirach was the leader of the Hitler Youth. He receives a 20-year sentence, but is released in 1966. So you can understand why it's really a question of, did justice prevail? Was there really justice? A lot of question marks left. I wasn't sure if we'd have time for this, but it looks like we'll be within about 30 seconds. So this is a really interesting story about a teacher in New York who also is a museum teacher fellow who heard about a group of people who survived in a train and their American soldiers who liberated them and how he actually brought them together. So we'll close with that, even though it's a little bit out of our sequence. Like I said, I wasn't sure we'd have time for it.
Good to see you too. Oh, this is great.
They were men and women who came together from all across the United States, from Canada, and from as far away as Israel. For several, it was their first face-to-face meeting with each other in more than 60 years.
How could a young guy like me be 88 years old? I'm not sure how many more reunions I'm going to go to. I never thought I would see anybody on that train again. It's an amazing, just amazing.
The occasion was to commemorate an event that occurred on April the 13th, 1945, as American armies rolled across Europe, liberating millions from the dominion of the Third Reich. On that day, the Army's 743rd Tank Division came upon a site near Magdeburg, Germany they never expected to see. Freight train cars alone on a track and filled wall to wall with over 2,000 men, women, and children, all of them Jews.
I remember the moment. I remember seeing this long freight train, long string of boxcars, and I can remember pulling the tank to the right and driving along the side of the train and seeing all these people that were on these boxcars. It was totally unexpected, and when I saw their condition, I was overwhelmed. I could remember thinking, what are we going to do with all these people and for all these people?
This fateful wartime incident might have remained known only to those who were directly part of it had it not been for a website created and managed by Matthew Rosell, a high school history teacher in Hudson Falls, New York, and a teacher fellow with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Rosell conducted several interviews with men and women whose lives were directly caught up in the events of the Holocaust. It was during an interview with Carol Red Walsh, a tank commander with the 743rd, that the story of the train car outside Magdeburg came to light.
And at the tail end of a 2-hour-long discussion, taped conversation that I had with him in his daughter's living room, his daughter chimed in and said, "Dad, did you tell Mr. Rosell about that train that stopped, that you had to go and investigate?" He said, "Oh, that's right, that train." And he launched into about how it was a beautiful April day. He and another tank commander went down and they investigated this train, stopped by the side of the tracks. They found it full of Jewish refugees. The other tank commander, he told me, was still alive in California and actually had photographs that he took of the liberation. And this Dr. Gross allowed me to place the photographs on the internet. We put those on our school website, and they sat there, not a lot of web traffic, but all of a sudden I got an email from a grandmother in Australia who had been a 7-year-old girl on that train. And she said that she clicked on the web link, the photographs open, and this was the day of her liberation in 1945. She said she fell out of her chair. It was very organic the way it all unfolded. I would open up my email inbox and there would be another message from a new survivor, somebody that I wasn't aware of before. These people are coming to me individually. They're not aware of each other for the most part before finding my website on the internet, for example. So it's just kind of unfolding.
At this time, I would like to call to the stage the rest of our soldiers and survivors, beginning with Mr. Francis Curry.
The surviving veterans of the 743rd are modest about their accomplishments, but this did not prevent the audience of students, teachers, town residents, and Holocaust survivors from honoring them at a special reunion event held at Hudson Falls High School in September 2009.
It's a gratifying and emotional experience to reunite with some of the survivors, to meet them face to face, and to call them my friends.
Those brave American soldiers, they were saying that they didn't do anything heroic, they just did their job. But with that job, they gave us back our life. And for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
It was a heady 4 days for the guests of honor and their families. A time to reminisce and reconnect. A time to enjoy each other's company and reflect upon what brought them together.
We were there, but it's still tough to wrap your mind around the situation that presented itself when those people were liberated on that train.
None of them put themselves up as being something special, and they have a great sense of humility and also a great sense of love. I feel that love just emanating from them to me and the others. And I think this sense of love that they have, I think, is what's also kept them going and giving all their lives.
And so we choose history teacher Matt Rosell, the Holocaust survivors of that train and those American soldiers who kept them and their story alive.
Matt Rosell's spotlight as ABC News' Charles Gibson's Person of the Week was a fitting conclusion to this special event. At the farewell banquet following the broadcast, Renee Roberge, the Hudson Falls High School teacher who served as the program's Master of Ceremonies, told liberators and survivors alike what he had learned from them.
Share the truth. The moral responsibility you had as a liberator to free a people from harm at a moment's notice, and as a survivor to save a generation from becoming complacent. You were heroes then, you are my heroes now.
I think we were in the right place at the right time, in the sense that we had people who are now at the stage in their life where they really wanted to send a message before they leave this earth. To see how it touched these students so deeply, that is where the real gratification is for me. And that's what this whole week was all about. Don't forget the past. You have to remember what happened. You can't just be a bystander.
You know, I bid those people goodbye, and I've never seen them again. So now here we are, 65 years later, to come this full 65 years, and we're coming together. And it's a rewarding experience.
Anyway, incredible with both the liberators and the survivors together, and then seeing the impact it made on students as well, so that they too can bear witness and share their stories. So sorry we ran a little bit over, but I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. And again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them by email if we don't get to them today.
Thanks, Kristen. We are at 2:02, but there, I just want to note that there was a post by one of our community members, Phil Keyboard, and he had a little story. He has a story that his mother, Riva, was in the DP camp and got to hand General Eisenhower a bouquet of flowers and welcome him to the camp. And she was 13 years old at the time. And I thought that was a nice addition to your presentation. There is a question. I think that we might, it's from Megan Olson, and we might need to answer it in email. It's just a bigger, it's about, does anti-Semitism still exist after liberation? So maybe we can tackle that one in email and get that out to everybody. Thank you for your presentation. I have just a couple of things I'd like to inform everybody. Week 1 and week 2 sessions, those are all uploaded on the GCRC website. Week 3 this week's will be done at the end of this week, and we're going to send another survey around. So please feel free to visit the website. Those are all up there. Tomorrow, we were going to go deeper, a little bit deeper into the topic of justice. Tomorrow's session was called Justice Delayed, and it was going to be a presentation by Ben Cohn, who was going to speak about his grandmother, Judith Meisel's story. And I'm saddened to tell everybody that Judith passed away on Tuesday. And so Ben's story is going to be replaced by Helen Siegel, who is a second generation survivor and is going to tell about her mother's story and their recent trip back to Poland. So I just wanted to pass along that information to everybody. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you the rest of the week. Thank you.